Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Lorene Elgert. I am a professor of environmental and sustainability studies at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Worcester, Massachusetts. And this past year, I taught our senior capstone seminar to our graduating students, to our seniors, in environmental and sustainability studies. And I decided to focus the seminar this year on environmental communication. So throughout the class, throughout the course, we looked at different ways of communicating information, the importance of science communication and environmental communication more specifically. We looked at ways and rationales for communicating different types of information and data. So we looked at things like creating infographics and data visualizations and presentations. We thought about things like who the audience would be, what kind of points would be important to them out of what we wanted to communicate, and what would be the best ways and venues for communicating with them. But a big part of our course was on storytelling. And so I invited 3 students from that class to come to ACE this year and present their projects. But before you go and look at their presentations individually, I would like to just provide a little bit of context for our discussions around the importance of storytelling in environmental communication. And so I'll start with a short presentation and then invite you to go and look at and listen to the students' presentations apart. So my presentation is called Stories Are Data, Teaching the Value of Storytelling in Environmental Studies. So we often understand stories as ways of communicating information and data. And we often appreciate stories because they engage active learning in listeners. Stories stick with people, they resonate, they create listeners can really relate to stories. Stories stick with people, they can remember a story much easier than they can remember, for example, a bunch of data or information or facts and figures, for example. And so these are often reasons why stories are valued in science communication and environmental communication specifically. But we wanted to sort of take it one step further and argue that stories are not just ways of communicating information, but stories themselves create information. They create knowledge, they create an expansion of our understanding of environmental problems. They bring different perspectives together. When a storyteller is telling a story, we and they both teach and learn about environmental problems and solutions. And we argue also that stories in this vein are perspectives, really they're different perspectives on reality, and rather than just individual perceptions. So really we consider stories as data and as valuable information in and of their own right, as opposed to just ways of communicating information. So Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie is a storyteller and an author of many wonderful novels. And she, in a TED Talk, she talks about how stories intersect with power. And she says, how stories are told, who tells them, when they're told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. And she urges us to confound what she calls the single story by challenging it with diverse stories that really reflect diverse perspectives, that contradict, complement, expand, and challenge the dominant narrative. And in this way, we can lead to a more accurate, a more generalized, and more just idea or notion, concept of what environmental problems are comprised of and how they should be addressed. So one example of how the single story reflects power in society, and how decentering the research gaze away from this single story is, one example of this is in the gendered knowledge production in medicine and vehicle safety. So Gabrielle Jackson has written for The Guardian an article entitled "The Female Problem: How Male Bias in Medical Trials Has Ruined Women's Health." So I'm sure many of you have heard of this. It's been, there's been a lot of really, really interesting and important work published over the last decade in this sort of, this idea of gendered knowledge production in medicine, and also has been extended then to vehicle safety. But Jackson argues that centuries of female exclusion has meant that women's diseases are often misdiagnosed, and remain a total mystery. So what she argues really is that knowledge production has revolved around white men, and they and their health have been constructed as sort of the standard. And that diagnoses, drugs, treatments are based on these standards. And of course, when they're applied to different bodies, they of course have very different outcomes. And so the same kind of idea has been applied to vehicle safety, where vehicles, safety mechanisms like seatbelts and airbags have been really constructed with the average white male body in mind. And so, researchers have looked at accident statistics and seen that, often women and other people bear a disproportionate amount of the injuries in vehicle crashes, because the safety mechanisms have been really standardized around this kind of idea of being a standard white man. So that's one example. Okay. So another example of how power is embedded in the stories we tell and the stories that shape our world is related to the increasing destruction and frequency of wildfires in California. So Indigenous practices of cultural burnings were outlawed by the government based on a single story of fire as frightening, as scary, and as destructive and damaging. This really led to policies that suppressed cultural practices of cultural burning. And what this led to was an accumulation of vegetation and fodder for fires. And this has propagated the growth and the spread, the growth in terms of the size of fires and the spread of fires. So not only are they more damaging, but they are more damaging in more widespread areas. And so after years of this knowledge suppression, finally, fire experts and state entities in California anyway, lately have been really working with Native American people in order to develop this sort of, expand the single story of fire and accommodate and listen to, learn from, and accommodate these sort of stories of cultural burning and why it's important. So finally, the final example that I want to talk to you about today to set the stage, this is the final example of the importance of stories and diverse stories. Comes from NPR reporting on the use of statistics to communicate the death toll of COVID over the last year. This past February, the US surpassed 500,000 COVID deaths. And officials were using this grisly milestone to impress upon the public the importance of precautions and vaccines. But often these officials found that the message missed the mark and did not really resonate with people. And they found really that, so in interviewing, this story talks about how stories of grief and loss create much more meaning and perspective around the impact of the pandemic. This idea that numbers became these empty signifiers and lost meaning for people. And in some cases, numbers became an affront, almost an insult to the experience of loss. And so this is another example where, multiple storylines and ideas that stories carry much more and much different kinds of meaning than statistics and other types of data. So again, I have 3 students. I'll just quickly introduce them. Hannah Schultz, Kate O'Neill, and Urmila Malik will talk to you about their individual projects. And I hope you enjoy their projects, and I look forward to our discussion at the conference. Thank you.